June 11, 1955, 300,000 fans packed shoulder to shoulder, with no barriers between their lives and cars built for war. In 4 seconds, a Mercedes tore through the crowd, leaving 83 dead and over 100 wounded, while organizers kept racing for profit. Officials blamed the drivers, but the truth behind who really caused the Le Mans disaster was buried for decades. The real answer changes everything you thought you knew. So how did a day fueled by national pride become the deadliest moment in racing history? In post-war Europe, Le Mans was more than a race. It was a proving ground for national pride, a stage where the scars of conflict met the ambitions of industry. On one side, Mercedes-Benz arrived determined to showcase German engineering reborn from the ashes, unveiling the 300 SLR, a machine built as much for speed as for spectacle. Its 8-cylinder engine produced 310 horsepower, a figure that dwarfed most of its rivals. The body, shaped from a magnesium alloy called electron, weighed almost nothing but burned at temperatures above 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Mercedes had equipped the car with a technological marvel, a hinged air brake that could be deployed at high speed, slowing the car dramatically. But unlike traditional brakes, this system gave no warning to those behind. No brake lights, no signal, just a sudden wall of deceleration. Jaguar, representing British resilience, brought the D-Type. Sleek and aerodynamic, it was the first Le Mans contender with disc brakes on all four wheels, a major leap in stopping power. The D-Type's 3.4-liter engine pushed out around 250 horsepower. Its real advantage was control. When Mike Hawthorne braked for the pits, he could drop from 140 to 60 miles per hour in seconds, trusting the discs to bite even at the edge of grip. That confidence and that suddenness would matter more than anyone realized. Further back, the Austin Healey 100S, driven by Lance Macklin, played the role of the underdog. With about 130 horsepower, it was outclassed for outright speed, but its low weight and simple design made it agile. Yet its sloping rear deck, a feature meant for style, would soon become a fatal ramp. The performance gap between these machines was not just a matter of seconds per lap. On the Mulsanne Straight, Mercedes and Jaguar could reach 170 miles per hour, while cars like Macklin's Austin Healey struggled to keep pace. Faster cars closed in on slower ones with barely a moment's notice, especially on the narrow, undivided pit straight where the crash would unfold. At the wheel, three men embodied the stakes. Mike Hawthorne, 26, was Jaguar's star, brilliant and brash, already a legend in British racing circles. Pierre Levey, nearly twice Hawthorne's age, was a French veteran haunted by a near miss at Le Mans 3 years earlier. Lance Macklin, a skilled but less celebrated Briton, was still nursing the wounds of a crash just weeks before. Each man brought his own ambitions, but the cars beneath them were shaped by a single idea: go faster at any cost. On June 11, 1955, the Circuit de la Sarthe was a patchwork of old roads and new machines. The technology outpaced the track and the rivalry outpaced common sense. Every lap, the tension between speed and safety grew sharper, setting the stage for a collision where engineering choices would prove as deadly as any error behind the wheel. Spectators pressed so close to the racing line at Le Mans in 1955 that a misstep could send them tumbling onto the tarmac. 300,000 people crowded the Circuit de la Sarthe that June, packed shoulder to shoulder along 8 miles of public road. There were no steel guardrails, no concrete walls, not even a chain-link fence. Only a low dirt berm and a sagging rope separated families from cars thundering past at nearly 170 miles per hour. On the pit straight, the crowd stood just feet from the edge. Children perched on ladders, parents balanced on benches, and fans leaned over the embankment for a better view. The pit area itself was little more than a painted line, with no separation between mechanics, officials, and the onrushing field. Danger was visible everywhere. Warnings had sounded for years. In 1953, British driver Tony Rolt and others protested the lack of barriers, calling the pit straight a disaster waiting to happen. Their complaints went unanswered. Organizers dismissed safety concerns, insisting that tradition and spectacle mattered more than new precautions. The circuit layout, unchanged since the 1920s, had never been designed for the speeds of post-war machines. Yet every year, more tickets were sold, more grandstands erected, and more people were packed into the same dangerous spaces. Those warnings were unanswered. Economic motives drove every decision. Each ticket meant more revenue, and a bigger crowd promised greater prestige for the Automobile Club de l'Ouest. When officials weighed the cost of new barriers against the profits from a record turnout, the answer was always the same: the show must go on. Even as engineers and drivers voiced alarm, budgets for safety upgrades were quietly shelved. In the weeks before the 1955 race, the only changes made were cosmetic: fresh paint on the pit wall, new banners for sponsors, nothing to keep a runaway car from plowing into the masses. Profit ruled the ledger. The result was a circuit where danger was not hidden, it was advertised. Spectators paid for the thrill of proximity, and organizers gave them exactly what they wanted. The air buzzed with anticipation, but beneath the excitement lay a simple truth: one mistake, one mechanical failure, and the crowd would have nowhere to run. In this environment, the line between competition and catastrophe was razor thin. The attraction of proximity came with a fatal price. The stage was set not just for a race, but for a tragedy that had been predicted and ignored. Engineers had written reports, drivers had raised alarms, and officials had chosen ticket sales over mitigation. 50 years before the world demanded change, the clues were there, yet they were dismissed, shelved, or lost. The final result was inevitable, and the consequence was human and permanent. Tragedy followed. Mike Hawthorne, leading in the Jaguar D-Type, barrels down the pit straight at 140 miles per hour. His pit signal flashes. Without hesitation, he slams on the brakes, disc brakes biting hard, the car dropping speed in an instant. Behind him, Lance Macklin in the Austin Healey 100S has no warning. Hawthorne's braking is sudden, but by the book, a move he has practiced countless times. Macklin reacts too late. Instead of braking, he yanks the wheel left, desperate to avoid the Jaguar now slowing rapidly in front of him. The Austin Healey veers sharply, crossing the racing line, its rear end swinging out into the path of Pierre Leve's Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR. Leve, approaching at over 150 miles per hour, has only a fraction of a second to respond. The Mercedes closes the gap in a blur, no time to swerve, no chance to brake. Leve raises his arm, a split-second warning to Fangio behind, before the front right wheel of the Mercedes clips the tail of Macklin's Austin Healey. Instantly, the nose of the 300 SLR lifts. The sloping rear deck of the Austin Healey acts as a ramp. The Mercedes launches skyward, twisting above the crowd-packed embankment. In 3 seconds, a chain reaction of decisions and physics transforms a routine pit entry into a catastrophe. The car is airborne, the grandstands are directly ahead, and the worst is yet to come. A roar of panic swept through the crowd as the magnesium body of Leve's Mercedes exploded on impact, igniting a fire that burned hotter than anything most had ever witnessed. The flames reached 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the grandstand into an inferno. Magnesium fires cannot be doused with water. Each attempt sent fresh bursts of white-hot sparks into the air, searing flesh and blinding rescuers. Bodies lay scattered, some unrecognizable, while the air filled with the stench of burning fuel and metal. Circuit physician Dr. Paul Emile rushed to the scene, overwhelmed by the scale of carnage. Dismembered bodies, shattered benches, and the screams of the injured painted a scene more like a battlefield than a sporting event. Marshals and medics pleaded with race control to stop the event, desperate to clear the dead and give survivors a chance. But the order from above was cold and final. The race continues. Officials instructed crews to clear the debris quickly and keep the worst out of public view. Hour after hour, the racing engines thundered past the smoking wreckage and the acrid haze. Families searched for loved ones as the fire raged. No announcement was made to the crowd. No moment of silence. The spectacle pressed on as if nothing had happened. In that decision, the priorities of Le Mans were made brutally clear. In 2005, a reel of amateur film, locked away for half a century, finally resurfaced. Shot by a spectator just yards from the pit straight, the footage offered a frame-by-frame account of the moments leading up to the disaster, details that had been debated, denied, and for decades hidden from public scrutiny. Analysts pored over the film, matching every movement to the official timeline and testimony. The evidence was crystal clear in slow motion. Mike Hawthorne's Jaguar signaled for the pits and braked in a controlled, predictable arc. His hand gesture, visible in several frames, warned those behind that he was slowing for his stop. There was no erratic move, no reckless lunge, just a textbook pit entry at racing speed. But the camera also captured the Austin Healey driven by Lance Macklin, trailing Hawthorne by a car length. Instead of braking, Macklin veered sharply left. His swerve was far more dramatic than necessary to avoid the Jaguar. The film showed he had space and time to slow down, yet he chose a violent maneuver that cut across the racing line. The swerve was decisive and dangerous. Pierre Levay's Mercedes, closing at over 150 miles per hour, had nowhere to go. The collision that followed was not the result of a single mistake, but of a sequence that left no room for escape. The physics and the footage made that plain. The footage dismantled early claims that Hawthorne's braking was to blame. It exposed the limits of human reaction at such speeds, and it raised new questions about why the initial investigation had focused so narrowly on driver error. For the first time, the narrative began to shift from the actions of men behind the wheel to the decisions made far above the track. The tape forced a re-examination, and it pointed toward a different kind of responsibility, one that extended beyond the cockpit. Warnings about the dangers at Le Mans were not just whispered in the paddock, they were put in writing. On May 10, 1955, engineer Jean-Marie Laborderie sent a memo to race officials, blunt and urgent, saying the barriers along the spectator areas were inadequate. He called for immediate reinforcement and warned that the density of the crowd created a risk of mass casualties. The reply came from race director Pierre Becherat less than 3 weeks before the start, and the answer was simple. There was no budget for major upgrades, and the event would go ahead as planned. As ticket sales soared, Laborderie pressed again, urging at minimum a reduction in spectator numbers. Becherat's answer was final. Projections were too high to close any sections. Every ticket sold meant more profit, and every empty seat was lost revenue. This was not the only corner cut. Lance Macklin, still recovering from a crash at the Mille Miglia in May, entered the race with injuries that should have kept him out of competition. In 1955, there were no medical checks and no enforced standards. Drivers raced at their own risk, and organizers looked the other way. Behind the scenes, the financial stakes were enormous. Contracts with sponsors and broadcasters locked the organizers into penalty clauses if the race was stopped early. Millions of francs were on the line, making safety an afterthought. The priorities were clear. The show would go on, no matter the warnings, no matter the danger. The decisions made in those final weeks turned a known danger into a certainty. The disaster that followed was not a surprise. It was the result of choices signed and sealed long before the flag dropped. 5 failures converged to turn a racing incident into mass death. First, the barriers, little more than rope and dirt, offered no protection against cars traveling at 150 miles per hour. Warnings from engineers and drivers had piled up for years, but each was brushed aside as unnecessary or too expensive. The crowd, drawn by promises of spectacle, was packed shoulder to shoulder just feet from the racing line. No limit was set on ticket sales. No effort was made to move families out of harm's way. Medical standards were non-existent. Drivers could race with untreated injuries, and no checks were enforced before the start. When the crash came, the response was chaos. Instead of halting the race to clear the dead and help the wounded, officials ordered debris removed and bodies hidden. The race continued, engines roaring past the burning wreckage. Inquiries would later point fingers in every direction, but the record is clear. These were not unpredictable acts of fate. They were choices. Decisions made in offices and boardrooms, signed off by men who knew the risks and accepted them. The cost was paid in lives, not just statistics. Among the dead that June evening were entire families. Their lives ended in seconds by a firestorm no one could escape. The official toll stands at 83, but the real cost rippled far beyond numbers. Survivors carried scars, physical and invisible, for decades. One family, the Dubois, lost both parents in front of their young daughter. She survived, but the memory of that day never faded. Across France and across Europe, grief hardened into outrage. Switzerland responded with a nationwide ban on motorsport, a prohibition that lasted more than 50 years. Other countries followed suit, canceling races and demanding answers. Yet inside the offices where decisions were made, accountability proved elusive. Pierre Becherat, who oversaw the race, kept his post for years, retiring with honors and no public reckoning for the tragedy under his watch. The disaster forced sweeping changes, including barriers, medical checks, and new rules for crowd safety. But for the families left behind, reforms came too late. The loss at Le Mans was permanent, and the people who profited from the spectacle walked away untouched. Today, every motorsport event is built on rules written in the aftermath of tragedy. Safety barriers, medical checks, and crowd restrictions exist because lives were lost when profit and spectacle came first. The real danger isn't speed, it is ignoring warnings until disaster teaches the lesson. How many more times will history need to repeat before prevention matters more than regret? Share your thoughts in the comments below.